Here in this video, we'll be talking about conflict management and ejections. We'll go over the processes that you can implement in order to diffuse situations and, if necessary, handle ejections with the most professionalism possible. First, if you want to see more videos like this about umpiring, like this video and subscribe to our channel. So first, let's go back to the very basics of what it means to be a sports official. As a sports official, you are there to do two things. First and foremost, you are there to enforce the rules, and second of all, you are there in order to facilitate the play of the game. People often forget that you can't really have games without sports officials, especially at a higher level. So what you do is necessary for the playing of the game, and therefore, we want to make sure that we're doing the best job we possibly can. However, if you do this for any length of time, there is always going to be some sort of conflict on the field that you have to manage. There's a couple of principles that we want to abide by in order to make sure that we are handling these things the best that we possibly can, making sure people stay in the game for as long as possible, and making sure that we can diffuse situations when there's opportunities for diffusal. So first, it's important to note that there are actually a lot of rules about when to eject or warn players, coaches, and fans in the rule book itself, specifically the high school rule book. Some of these things are simple rule violations, but others are meant to prevent conflict and further escalation in the future. An example of this is verbal interference. If you have a player going to catch a fly ball and one of the teams yells drop it or something, causing them to bobble the ball and not get the play, that is actually grounds for an ejection according to high school rules. And the reason for this is because if one team knows which player said that, the likelihood of that player getting up to bat and getting thrown at is a lot higher. So we want to make sure that we're handling those things early to prevent further injury and further escalation. While we don't want to turn this into the ump show, we do want to retain control of the game. And the example I just gave is why. However, that's conflict between people that aren't you that you have to manage. But what happens when the conflict is actually directed at yourself, the official? So first, let's go over the 3 P's of an ejection. Now, I know I'm jumping straight to ejection, but there's actually a lot of steps that happen before this, but these 3 P's can help you categorize certain behaviors. So the 3 P's for an ejection are prolonged, profane, or personal. If you have any one of those things, that would be ground for an ejection, or at the very, very least, a very serious warning. However, only one of those 3 do you actually have any sort of control over, and that's prolonged. You can't decide whether or not the comments someone makes towards you are profane or personal. However, you do have the opportunity to shut down a conversation before it becomes prolonged, and that's what we're going to talk about first. Most of the time, conflict between an official and someone else doesn't just come out of the blue, but rather it starts small and then escalates. And the first step in that conflict resolution is simply to ignore it. Many times, fans, coaches, and players will not get the play that they want, and they'll make an offhanded comment about the official because they're looking for someone to blame. If you were to address that the first time that it happens, you're probably going to escalate the situation further for something that may just be a one-time thing and then be done. That's why the first step is to ignore it. When someone makes a comment about a strike zone or an out call or whatever it is, that's when you simply ignore the first comment unless it's particularly egregious. And the way you would know if it's particularly egregious is if it would fall into one of the other 2 categories that we talked about of profane or personal. Now let's assume that didn't work and that the comments keep coming towards you. So we've already passed that ignore phase and now we're into an acknowledge phase. We want to acknowledge that we can at least hear what the criticism is. There's a couple of different ways to do this, and depending on the situation and even who you're dealing with, you might approach this differently. So you could verbally acknowledge that you hear the person's complaints. If you have a player in the batter's box and you call a strike that they didn't like and they make some sort of comment about you, how that wasn't a strike, it's probably a good idea to verbally and quietly say, I hear you, I understand, I thought it was a strike. Something to that extent. You may not use those words, but you're at least letting the other person vent their frustration, you're acknowledging that you heard it, and then hopefully that's the end of it. Because it is possible that they just want to make you aware of a problem. Maybe your zone is too big, maybe your zone is too small, whatever it is, simply acknowledging the other person's frustration and that you at least heard them can be a way to diffuse a situation before escalating further. But let's assume that doesn't work. So at this point, you've ignored a comment, you've acknowledged a comment, and now they're coming at you again. This is where we would move into the warning category. Now, there are a lot of different ways to approach this warning. However, I want to address a couple of common poor practices that umpires sometimes adopt. What we don't want to do is, again, escalate things further, but the other objective here is we also don't want to talk ourselves into a corner. So for example, if you say one more word and you're out of here, or something to that extent, and then the coach says something not ejection worthy, well, now you've kind of gone back on what you just warned them about, and you probably shouldn't be throwing them out, but you kind of told them that you did. You've talked yourself into a corner and you've painted a big mess of the situation. I also would make the case that words like that probably aren't the best at de-escalating a situation. So again, we're going to go back to the beginning of what we talked about. We want to remain professional and we want to remain simple. If you've gone through the two phases of ignore and acknowledge, and now you've gotten to the warning phase, this is where I would lean towards phrases like, that's enough, you're done, whatever it is to communicate that you're shutting down this conversation. A small side that I want to make here is that in baseball, there's a lot of saying words that don't mean what they actually mean. A lot of conflict in baseball is very passive aggressive, and you actually have to ask the question, what is the person actually saying? So here's an easy one. Pitch comes in, you call a ball, and the coach yells, that pitch is right there. What's he actually saying? Well, what he's saying is, you missed the call. He's making a comment about the pitch, but he's actually making a comment about you. Again, that's an easy one, but here's a more complex one. What if he tells his pitcher, you're right there? Well, now that could mean one of two things. That could mean, yeah, he's actually encouraging his pitcher because his pitcher is pitching just outside the strike zone. He's actually not making a comment about you, but he also could be saying that in a way that is telling you that you're missing calls. This is where we do want to exercise discretion. Most of the time, if a coach says something like that, he is actually talking to his pitcher. But I have had situations where you can tell in the way that they're saying those words that they're actually talking about you, and not only that, they are saying it loud enough that everybody on the field can hear it. So that's where you have to play the game of ignore, acknowledge, warn. So let's go back to those warnings. If we've now gone through those stop signs of that's enough, you're done, or whatever, and they are still continuing to argue with you, now we've reached that prolonged characteristic, which means that it is grounds for an ejection. Now, I will also make the case that very rarely does this happen where you also haven't gotten personal or profane comments involved as well, but sometimes the coach is just arguing with you for too long. You've already attempted to shut down the conversation multiple times, which means now we've moved to a point of an ejection. Now, since we've gotten to the point of an ejection, let's talk about those other two characteristics for a second. What does it mean that something's personal? Well, here's two phrases for you. That call sucked, or you suck. Those mean two different things. One is about the call that you just made, which may have been a sucky call, and the other one is about you. If you have comments of a personal nature in an argument, that is technically grounds for an ejection. Now, if it's the first comment, you may want to go with a very serious warning first. That just depends on the situation and how it came about, but that is technically, again, grounds for an ejection. What does it mean when comments are profane? Well, you might think that's self-explanatory, but this can actually get more difficult because people in high school have a slightly different vocabulary than the kids that are 10 years old. And even more than that, somebody in Memphis probably has a different vocabulary than someone in New Jersey or where we're located in Chicago. So again, the best thing I can say about this is use your discretion, and there's a difference between someone being profane to you and someone being profane at you, and make sure that you know the difference. Alright, so now we've talked about those three characteristics of personal, profane, and prolonged. Now we've gotten to an ejection. What happens now? Well, first let's talk about what you're supposed to do. You've thrown somebody out, where are you supposed to go? This depends on whether or not you're by yourself or you have a partner. If you do have a partner, things are really easy. You play a little bit of good cop, bad cop. You've thrown the coach, the player, whoever it is out, and then your partner gets in between you and the person you threw out and helps to move them off the field. You turn, you walk the other way, you stand on the opposite side of the field from where they are, and your partner now gets to have the fun job of trying to get somebody to leave the field. Yay! If you are the partner in this situation, don't get involved in the situation until there's actually an ejection. If there's an argument going on between two people, don't make it 3, because 3 turns into 4, turns into 5, turns into 6, and then you've got a bunch of people screaming at each other. Let those two people argue, don't get involved, and then as soon as there's an ejection, then you're going to take over for your partner, let your partner get away from the situation, and you're going to help encourage the other person to leave the field. Now, what happens if you don't have a partner? Well, things can become a little bit more difficult. So first, let's assume the person that you ejected wasn't the head coach. In this case, you may turn to the head coach of the team of the person that you threw out because they should be helping you to manage that conflict. And I would say more than half the time this happens. The head coach will usually help get an assistant coach, a player, or even a fan off the field and away from the game because those are their responsibility. If the head coach is not helping you, or maybe the person you ejected was the head coach, then all you're going to do is go and stand on the opposite side of home plate from the person that you ejected. If they come out to you to continue to argue, I would simply walk away and emphasize that this isn't the major leagues, they aren't getting fined, so guess what? There is no getting your money's worth. It's the end of the conversation and you're not going to continue to engage. So what else needs to happen after you eject somebody? Well, most of the time you will need to submit a report to somebody else. Now, if you're working travel games, that might simply be your assigner because they are going to forward that to the league commissioner, whatever it might be. If it's a high school game, you're going to submit that report totally differently, and if it's a college game, you also submit that report totally differently. Most of the time though, your assigner will make it clear what the process needs to be if you do eject somebody from a game. Now, that said, you do not need to eject somebody in order to write a game report. If you have conflict that goes right up to the brink of an ejection but then diffuses, it would probably still be helpful for your league, for the assigner, for whoever it may be, that you submit a report and at least let them know what's going on. One, because if you did something wrong and you handled the situation poorly, they can know so that they can let you know what to do next time. Or two, maybe there has been problems with this team, this player, this parent, this coach, whatever it might be in the past, and disciplinary action needs to be taken. Hopefully this video helps you a little bit to handle conflict and manage ejections when they happen. Again, your job is to enforce the rules and to facilitate the play of the game. This isn't the show, but there are times when players, fans, coaches will direct comments in a derogatory manner towards the official, and you need to handle them. Make sure that you handle them professionally and that you handle them simply and that you follow all the necessary steps to make sure that if someone gets thrown out, it wasn't your fault and it was theirs. Leave a comment of some of your best ejection stories. People who have been doing this for a while usually have some pretty great ones and I love to hear them. Like this video and subscribe to the channel, and hopefully we'll see you again.